Hello, and welcome to the Significant Disproportionality webinar series. This series is dedicated to supporting LEAs who are engaging in mitigating significant disproportionality in their particular catchments. This series is based upon the PDE Equitable Practices Hub. In particular, each webinar has focused on a specific pillar of practice. This webinar is focused on data practices. My name is Dr. Nikole Hollins-Sims. I'm an educational consultant with the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network, PATN, out of the Harrisburg office. Please note, the resources presented in the series are not required as part of the significant disproportionality process. These are simply to offer guidance should an LEA choose to seek out training and/or technical assistance. Again, welcome to a review of the Data Practices pillar from the PDE Equitable Practices Hub. Please see the infographic on the screen that indicates our definition. To do their best, students must feel safe at school. A healthy and safe environment can help students thrive, and every student, regardless of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, should be provided the opportunity to learn, free from discrimination, fear, or harassment. As you can see, the equity pillars are listed there for you. In previous webinars, we have covered a virtual tour of the Equitable Practices Hub, the General Equity Practices pillar, and the Self-Awareness pillar. As we indicated, this session will be focused on data practices. In forthcoming sessions, there will be a focus on family and community engagement, academic equity, and disciplinary equity. Additionally, please note that in the Equitable Practices Hub, users may access content and resources based upon the roles that they serve. Spheres are indicated in the hub that allow users to choose from school and district, classroom, or individual. The objectives for today's webinar are to identify data practices to inform equity in action, describe data practices to mitigate significant disproportionality in special education, and to review the types of data needed to action plan and engage in root cause analysis, otherwise known as RCA. As we begin this webinar, I'd like for you to think about some focus questions. As you think about the pillar of data practices, consider what is your current data system or systems that you have access to? Are you able to disaggregate data by subgroup? Meaning, are you able to take overall data and narrow it down to focus on a particular group and how they're responding to the things that have been put in place in your system? The third question is who has access to the data? How many people have access, and are the people that do have access able to make database decision-making processes occur? Lastly, is there a team that analyzes and problem solves through root cause analysis to determine how action planning may be done? So why use data to determine equity? As I mentioned in a previous slide, disaggregating data is critical. Additionally, a metric like risk ratios allows us to know the rate or the likelihood of certain outcomes happening for specific groups. Through root cause analysis, we're able to narrow down what might be at the root of some of these outcomes, and that allows us to problem solve and action plan. There are some hallmarks to know whether or not data will give us what we need to determine if we're equitable. And so things like focusing on disproportionate representation in, let's say, advanced placement courses or special education allow us to do just that. Additionally, identifying who is or isn't present at something like PTO events are also examples of ways that schools can begin the equity work. As we consider disproportionality and what we've covered above as examples, those are markers that highlight potential symptoms that could be underlying cultural mismatches that are present in the school or LEA. And that's how root cause analysis can help us get to those places to determine how we can best intervene. As we consider the data practices pillar, one key guiding question to consider would be, how might our educational community use our own specific data in order to drive equity efforts within our community? Local data is critical. It helps shape and inform the work that we do. Equity work in particular is driven by families and communities, and data helps to supplement or substantiate what we're seeing and hearing from those stakeholders. In addition, as additionally an overview to consider, boots on the ground data provide us with an empirical, grounded, and measurable framework from which many valuable insights and guidance can be gleaned. As providers of education, it's important for us to have clear database goals and best practices to ensure that we're properly driving the desired outcomes. The Equitable Practices Hub with the Data Practices pillar is organized into what's called multiple measures of data. And I'd like to unpack the four of these briefly for us. As we consider demographic data, these are manifested in school variables such as ethnicity, socioeconomic status of families, English language proficiency, and attendance turnover. It's driven by local factors such as employment rates, migration patterns, population density, and local political decisions. Perceptions or perceptual data illustrate student impressions about teacher instruction, family beliefs about the quality of education and other dimensions of school life, and other beliefs of stakeholders that are usually gathered by conducting surveys or simply holding conversations. School processes or school process data informs the community about structures and routines, such as courses to offer, scope and sequence of delivery, annual teacher turnover rates, and typical class sizes. School processes include curriculum, instructional, and assessment practices. And lastly, student learning. Student learning data usually refers to standardized test results, grade point averages, standards assessments, and authentic assessments. I like to provide examples around each one of the multiple measures just so that you know what you could potentially access to connect these measures together. Some examples of demographic data would be things like the Future Ready PA Index, which we know allows us to get an overall snapshot of what students are able to learn, as well as the demographics of that particular district or LEA. The Future Ready PA Index is a comprehensive progress report that essentially provides parents and community members with easy to understand information about overall Pennsylvania schools and student success. The Pennsylvania Information Management System, or PIMS, really focuses on longitudinal data. It's a system that focuses on data at the student level, that focuses on reporting requirements, and allows for robust decision support tools. It's available in every LEA, and it's one that most LEAs reflect on to determine how students are performing, attendance, as well as discipline. That then leads us to early warning systems. Early warning systems, out of the work of Robert Balfance and Johns Hopkins University, speaks to the ABCs: attendance, behavior, and course performance. Your student management system may already have criteria built inside of it that speak to cutoff scores that allow you to know if a student is considered at risk, low risk, or no risk in any one of those three indicators. Early warning systems primarily support the overall efforts of knowing whether the system is responsive to students that may be at risk for high school or even middle school issues that lead to dropout or lack of school completion. Lastly, Penn data. Penn data is a special education placement and identification data source that allows you to know by your specific LEA if there are concerns related to overrepresentation. This is one particular area where you can take a look by subgroup and see how many students by percentage are receiving particular outcomes as a result of being identified or placed in a special education structure. As we move on to the other multiple measure, this is perception data. These are examples of additional data you may access, such as the Pennsylvania School Climate Survey, which is available through our Pennsylvania Department of Education and essentially provides us with a number of pieces of information about how the overall system is viewed. Parents, staff, students, and community members have questions that are related to social emotional learning, student support, high expectations or academic challenges, and safe schools. Typically, an LEA would work with their intermediate unit to analyze the data and create an action plan. Similarly, we can look at other examples such as the PAYS data, which is provided by our Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, or PCCD. And this particular survey is given biennially to 6th, 8th, 10th, and 12th graders and administered in the fall of odd number years. So this has been happening since 1989, and it's no cost for any Pennsylvania school district or school who wishes to participate. This collects information on youth knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors towards things like alcohol, tobacco, other drug use, and other problem behaviors. What our youth know, think, and believe about antisocial behaviors are also captured in this data. And additionally, what our youth think about their own school environment. These particular two are Pennsylvania specific and are accessible through our Pennsylvania Department of Education and our partner with PCCD. And so with that, that data is readily available to any LEA to help with determining how students are responding to our systems. Additional resources that are available on a national level would be the Student Engagement Instrument, which comes out of the Check and Connect work and the University of Minnesota. The Self Assessment Survey, which is mainly a survey given to staff members and, in particular, sites that are engaging in positive behavior interventions and supports. Another great survey option would be the Mid Atlantic Equity Consortium, which has a plethora of equity surveys that can either be completed by students, staff, and/or families. School processes, as we mentioned, are important as we think about how we want to construct or understand structures and routines in our particular system. And so these are just examples of things that are available from a school process perspective: codes of conduct, comprehensive plans, student enrollment, the number of students who are receiving remediation or tutoring or enrichment, LEA specific MTSS multi tiered systems of support, or positive behavior intervention and support manuals that delineate processes and frameworks, policies that are specific to discipline or academic integrity, and attendance policies. Each of these, again, really speak to the structure and the routine of the system and can help to really articulate and corroborate what you may be seeing in the perception data that we just talked through. And finally, the student learning data. Many of us are familiar with the various types of assessment that are available to us in Pennsylvania. And so I'm just going to list these out as I know that there's quite a bit of familiarity around these. The Pennsylvania System of School Assessment, the PSSA, the Keystone exams, the Pennsylvania Alternate System of Assessment, or the PASA, our growth measure, which is Pennsylvania's Value Added Assessment System, or PVAS, and finally, your own progress monitoring data that allows you to know how students are responding over time to a particular instructional method or an intervention. So, as we consider those multiple measures of data and how vast our data sources are, we have a lot to take in when we're sitting at data team tables and analyzing. And it's important when we're engaging in these discussions or these chats that as we review, analyze, and action plan around data, are our conversations what we would consider upward or downward spirals? And so, what that means essentially is as we're looking at, let's say, perception data, or we're looking at student learning data, for instance, that kind of gives us a snapshot of where we are as a process or as a system. Are we having conversations that put blame essentially on the student or on the family and the community? Are we not taking ownership of the things that we do have control over? If so, that potentially leads to downward spiral conversations, which sometimes are called problem admiration experiences. And so we sit in the problems and we don't necessarily figure out what our solutions could be. Whereas upward spiral conversations are more solution focused and within our locus of control. So while we understand that if students come from a certain community or are of a different background, we know that that's important for us to understand. However, that should not prohibit us from making action steps about what we can do as a system to make their experiences better when they're with us. And that's the importance of ensuring that even though we may have a lot of data that we can sit and analyze for days on end, we want to have an efficient process that focuses on what we have control over. And that's where those upward spiral conversations would be beneficial. And so, as we think about equitable database decision making, again, we can look at it as a bridge or a way for us to get to results to ensure that what we're doing with all of the data that we have is effective and efficient. And so, Nancy Love, one of the key authors around collaborative inquiry, talks about this concept of a bridge. And I think that this depicts it very clearly. So we have data on one side and results on the other side. And the only way to connect those is through this bridge of collaborative inquiry. So remember, I mentioned us sitting at a data team table and having to come up with how we're going to analyze an action plan and do root cause analysis. We have to think about what structures we need to have in place to engage in that process efficiently. So we begin with professional development, understanding in a session like this, what are our specific roles and what are the things that we need to make the bridge sustain? So one of the pieces we need is leadership and capacity. We know that administrators hold a critical key to the work that we do in schools, but how are we as leaders building capacity among our teachers, among our other staff members, to build capacity in them to take on some leadership around the data? Then we engage in structured collaboration. So, as we mentioned, not sitting at the table simply saying the parents this, the child that. We're focused on a structured and efficient process that takes us through a structured agenda that allows us to keep time, to focus solely on the data, to understand that we may not finish everything in this one meeting, but that it will be an ongoing process that will allow us to achieve what we're setting out to do in a structured way. We know that frequent data use is important. So simply looking at data once a year or even twice a year may not be enough for us to make some adequate decisions. And then from there, how are we using the data to inform our instruction or to change how we're approaching certain things? And that's the instructional improvement. To keep the bridge afloat or to sustain the bridge is our culture, trust, and equity. And so we understand that our school culture really tells us if we're in a trusted space where we can have those very critical conversations that allow us to engage in this collaboration. And equity being at the core tells us that we need to ensure that what we're doing is responsive for all and not just a certain group or focusing on just one group at the expense of another. And so, with all of that, we get to results, and that is the ultimate goal around database decision making through an equitable lens. So, I've mentioned quite a few times that we can be data rich and information poor. How can we be data rich and information rich? George Bash, one of the premier researchers around MTSS, talks about the concept of equity is access, equity is process, and equity is outcomes. So if we reflect back on the bridge that we just covered, we know that access is one of the key components of equity for students, access and opportunity, so that they have the opportunity to be able to showcase what they're strong in, what their assets are. And so, with that, we know that equity is also a process. So, in that process of going across the bridge, that is the process of us engaging in equitable decision making. And finally, equity is outcomes. So, once we've allowed and provided the access and then engaged in the process of ensuring that it's sustainable, the outcome should be equitable to follow. So, in closing, how do equitable data practices support addressing significant disproportionality? It allows LEA teams to fully analyze multiple data sources to determine action steps for immediate, short term, and long term planning. We know that some data sources lend themselves to more long term goals, whereas others we know we could hit the ground running tomorrow. It's allowing us through that process that we just mentioned to engage in equitable decision making and action planning that tell us where we should put some of those goals in a realistic way. It allows for LEA teams to begin to reframe their overall frameworks or approaches and evaluate data through an equitable lens. So instead of the blame game that we sometimes do, we're human, we naturally sometimes fit into that space. How do we begin to call in each other on not doing the blame game and ensure that we're focusing what's within our locus of control and trying to eliminate as much as possible bias statements that stall our work? Lastly, we know that data alone is not enough. The process of engaging in root cause analysis really allows us to get insight through multiple methods to evaluate disproportionate outcomes in discipline, identification, and placement. And as I said, as if we go through that process of the bridge or collaborative inquiry, it allows us to take each one of those three indicators and drill down to figure out how we can best support the students that are not accessing an equitable process related to those three indicators of discipline, identification, and placement in special education. So, where can you focus? Earlier in the session, we provided some focus questions or guiding questions to think about. As you consider your respective role, whether you're an educator in the classroom or a related service provider, assess current data sources and your access. Determine your ability to engage in root cause analysis and planning, and ensure that if you feel less confident in those processes, that you engage or request professional development for you and your team to make sure that you feel more confident to go across that bridge. And then leaders and administrators, how will you support staff to build capacity to leverage their engagement in database decision making? We can't do it by ourselves as leaders and administrators. We need to empower other leaders and build that capacity. So, how do we engage them to ensure that they have what they need to be able to process through that root cause analysis and ensure that the processes and outcomes that we're seeking can be achieved through our data decision making? If there are additional questions, please feel free to reach out with any. And if you seek out technical assistance, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. My email is provided at nhollinsims@patent.net. Thank you for your time.